The rain had just started when I reached the nearly empty bus stop at the end of the street. The cold wind pushed the mist across the road, making the flickering streetlights look dim and distant. Midnight had already passed, and the entire neighborhood felt strangely quiet. I checked my phone for the schedule, but the screen showed no signal. Just as I considered walking home instead, two pale headlights slowly appeared through the thick fog. The bus approached unusually slowly, its engine humming softly as it rolled through the misty street. It looked older than most city buses, with faded paint and slightly cracked windows that reflected the streetlights in dull yellow lines. When it finally stopped in front of the shelter, the doors opened with a long mechanical hiss. The sound echoed across the empty road, making the quiet night feel even stranger. For a moment, I hesitated before stepping inside. The air in the bus felt colder than outside, carrying a faint metallic smell that lingered in the dim interior. The lights above were weak and yellow, barely illuminating the rows of seats stretching toward the back. A few passengers were already sitting inside, scattered quietly throughout the bus. None of them looked up when I entered. I walked slowly down the narrow aisle, my footsteps echoing softly against the metal floor. The passengers remained completely still, each one staring straight ahead as if they were lost in their own thoughts. Their faces looked pale under the weak lights, and something about the silence between them felt unnatural. I chose a seat near the middle of the bus and sat down carefully. The doors closed behind me with a loud mechanical click that made me flinch slightly. A second later, the engine rumbled louder, and the bus slowly began moving again. I leaned toward the window, expecting to see the familiar streets of the city passing by outside. Instead, the fog seemed thicker now, swallowing the buildings and street signs until the road ahead looked strangely empty. Several minutes passed without a single stop. Normally this route had multiple stations, especially near this part of town. But the bus continued driving forward without slowing down. The dim lights flickered slightly as the engine vibrated beneath the floor. I glanced around again and realized none of the other passengers had moved even a little since I sat down. One man sat 2 rows ahead of me, staring straight forward with an expressionless face. A woman near the back leaned against the window, her reflection pale and lifeless in the glass. It almost looked like they weren't breathing. I tried to convince myself they were just tired commuters heading home late, but something about their complete stillness made my chest tighten. I turned my attention back to the window. The city had completely disappeared now. Instead of buildings and traffic lights, there was only a long dark road stretching endlessly through the fog. No other cars passed us. No street signs appeared, just empty highway and darkness on both sides, as if the bus had quietly left the world behind. A strange feeling of unease slowly grew in my stomach. I stood up and carefully walked toward the front of the bus, holding the metal rail for balance as the vehicle moved steadily forward. The driver sat motionless behind the wheel. His shoulders were stiff, and his hands remained fixed on the steering wheel without any visible movement. "Excuse me," I said quietly. My voice sounded louder than expected in the silent bus. The driver didn't respond. I stepped closer and tried again. "Sir, where is the next stop?" Still nothing. He didn't turn his head or even blink. The faint glow from the dashboard lights illuminated part of his face, revealing eyes that stared forward without any expression. A cold wave of fear ran through my chest. Something about his face looked wrong, almost lifeless. His skin appeared pale and stiff, and his eyes looked strangely empty in the dim light. I slowly stepped backward, my heartbeat growing louder in my ears. When I turned around, I noticed several passengers were now looking directly at me. Their heads had turned slightly in my direction without me noticing when it happened. Their faces remained emotionless, their eyes dark and unfocused. No one spoke, no one blinked. The silence inside the bus suddenly felt unbearable, like the air itself had grown heavy and thick. I slowly returned to my seat, trying to avoid their gaze. Just as I sat down again, the electronic route display above the driver flickered faintly. At first it showed nothing but static lines. Then the letters slowly appeared one by one across the glowing screen. The message was short and simple, but it made my stomach twist with fear. Final route. I stared at the glowing words on the route display, trying to understand what they meant. Final route. The letters flickered slightly as the bus continued moving through the endless fog outside. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. I looked toward the driver again, but he remained completely motionless behind the wheel. The engine kept humming steadily, carrying us farther away from anything that looked familiar. Panic slowly began to rise inside my chest. I stood up again and pressed the stop button above the window. Normally the bus would signal the driver and prepare to stop at the next station. But nothing happened. The button light stayed dark. The bus didn't slow down even slightly. The only sound inside the vehicle was the quiet vibration of the engine beneath the floor. I pressed the stop button again, harder this time. Still nothing. The road outside remained the same endless stretch of darkness and fog. No streetlights, no buildings, no signs of life anywhere around us. My reflection in the window looked pale and tense. For the first time since boarding the bus, I felt a deep, uncomfortable certainty that something was terribly wrong. As I turned back toward the aisle, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The passengers were no longer staring forward. Slowly, silently, several of them had turned their heads toward me. Their eyes looked empty, almost glass-like under the dim lights. None of them spoke or moved beyond that small motion. Yet the feeling of being watched suddenly filled the entire bus. One man sitting near the front began moving his hand slowly upward. The movement was stiff and unnatural, like someone waking after a long sleep. My breathing became shallow as I watched him. His pale finger lifted and pointed silently toward the front windshield of the bus. The other passengers remained still, their dark eyes fixed on me. Confused and terrified, I slowly turned my head toward the front window. At first there was nothing but thick fog covering the road ahead. Then faint shapes began appearing through the mist. Small glowing lights flickered in the distance, scattered across the darkness like distant stars slowly growing closer. As the bus continued forward, the shapes became clearer. What I first thought were lights turned out to be rows of parked vehicles. The fog parted slightly, revealing something enormous ahead of us. My heart skipped a beat as the bus entered a massive empty parking lot that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Dozens of buses stood quietly in perfect rows across the lot. Their engines were silent, their headlights dark. Every single one of them looked old and worn, just like the bus I was sitting in. Some had cracked windows, others had rusted signs, but they all shared the same eerie stillness. As we drove deeper into the parking lot, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Through the dusty windows of the parked buses, I could see figures sitting inside them. Passengers, just like the ones around me. Pale faces staring forward in the dim lights. Row after row of buses filled with silent passengers stretched across the massive lot. None of them moved, none of them spoke. The fog drifted slowly between the vehicles, making the entire place look unreal, like some forgotten graveyard for buses and the people trapped inside them. For the first time since I had boarded, the bus finally began to slow down. The brakes hissed softly as we rolled toward an empty space between two identical vehicles. My chest tightened with fear as the bus came to a complete stop. The doors opened slowly with a long metallic hiss.